All right, good evening, everyone. If I could have your attention, we're going to get started. Good evening and welcome. It's really nice to see so many familiar faces, so many new faces gathered here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Talar Chahinian. I teach the Armenian language courses here at UCI, and for this academic year, while Professor Huri Berberian, is on sabbatical, I am serving as the interim director for the UCI Armenian Studies Center. I'm really pleased to welcome you all to this inaugural talk of the academic year featuring art historian, Dr. Vazken Tavitian. Today's talk launches our first in the series Armenian and Meghrouni lecture series. Really glad to have you here. We have exciting programming coming up for our subsequent quarters. So I really encourage all of you, if you haven't done so already, to check out our website, the UCI Center for Armenian Studies website, and subscribe to our newsletter to stay connected and to stay informed for future events. Our speaker today, Dr. Vazken Tavitian, I'm really pleased to welcome him and to introduce him. He's an associate faculty member at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oxford. He defended his doctoral thesis in art history entitled Image of the Bantucht Hamal of Constantinople, Late 19th Century Representations of Migrant Workers from Ottoman Armenia and he did his work at Birkbeck College, University of London. Along with Boris Agemian, he co-edits the journal Études Arméniennes Contemporaines, published by the Bibliothèque Nubar, based in Paris. He is the author of several articles and is currently working on the monograph Art, Realism, and the Politics of Social Reform, Reading Late 19th Century Visual Representations of the Armenian Hamal of Constantinople. His talk today, as you see up there, is entitled An Encyclopedic Compendium of Everything Ottoman Armenian, Reading Teotig's Everyone's Almanac through the prism of art and cultural history. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tavitian.
Thank you so much, Talar. I'm really happy to be here finally. I think this sort of talk was postponed about 3 times because of COVID, etc. So we're finally doing it. And I'm really happy to be here and to be doing this talk, because had I sort of come here 2 years ago, I would have done a completely different talk. So this is new material and it's work in progress. So before I even start, I would basically welcome comments, etc., because it's a work in process. Sort of my thought processes are not exactly totally clear. So I'm going to subject you to a survey across several editions, 19 actually, of Teotig's Everyone's Almanac. So let's start. One of the reasons I started looking at Teotig was because, as an art historian looking at the art history of Ottoman Armenians, Armenian art production in the Ottoman Empire during the second half of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, is that unlike art historians who are studying the French Impressionists or Dutch still lives, or British pre-Raphaelites, don't really have the luxury of going to the Rijksmuseum or the British Library or the Musée d'Orsay to basically find your material. So you have to basically start thinking outside the box. And one of the ways to sort of try and find material is to look everywhere you can. And an almanac is not something that someone would actually think about sort of, for finding sort of art historical material. But Teotig's Almanac is much more than an almanac. I mean, the whole sort of title Almanac is really doing it a disservice. So what I want to do is I want to sort of present to you the kind of material that one finds in Teotig's the Almanac, and take you through it, and see what we come up with. So on with the presentation. Words of wisdom warn us never to judge a book by its cover. I will open this presentation by throwing caution to the wind and doing exactly that. The image adorning the cover of the 1914 edition of the popular Everyone's Almanac, Armenian, commissioned from the Constantinople artist and illustrator Stepan Arayan, depicts an attractive architectural edifice with clear references to neoclassicism and the Baroque, but also more subtle nods to the emerging modernism of the day. Within various niches in the two-dimensional structure, Arayan has situated 10 putti, 8 of whom act as allegorical representations of the arts. Starting from the top, going clockwise, we have painting, Meghrouni, architecture, Meghrouni, engraving, Meghrouni, theater, Hadron, science or knowledge, Meghrouni, it means both, theater, Tadron, we've already said that, Elif, that's especially for you, theater, there's a lot of material for you in there. Music, literature, and sculpture, It is tempting to think of the image as a sort of visual manifesto of the diverse material that the co-editors and co-founders of the popular almanac, the Constantinople writer and publisher Theodoros Lapchincian, better known simply as Teotig, and his wife, the writer and intellectual Ashagui Teotig, envisaged and including in its pages. So the dominant classicizing forms of the 1914 cover suggest the artists and editors' partiality for the ideas and forms of a Western European Enlightenment as the foundations of a civilization and the basis for a new dawn in the flowering of knowledge, the arts and sciences. From his prime position at the top of the entablature, a standing nude putto with artist's paint palette and brush in hand is the only one gazing directly at the viewer. It's the one at the top. Yet considering the content of the volume and the 7 others preceding it, it is unlikely that the pole position awarded to painting at the pinnacle of the structure suggests that the Teotigs had assigned a higher value to painting above the rest of the arts. Typographically, we see marked at the center of the visual edifice the year 1914, followed by the subhead 8th year, confirming the Almanac as an already established publication, an advertisement of the breadth of material included in the volume with 200 images and 200 subjects, the name of the Constantinople printing house, the contemporaneous of the typefaces used provide a projection of modernity. Hello, welcome. Hi. This modernity is reinforced by the decorative symbolism of the rising rays of light from behind the edifice, signifying a present and future can only be built on the solid foundations of the arts and knowledge, and denotes the importance of the ancient classical in our understanding of the modern. By 1914, in its 8th year of publication, the well-established and very popular Armenian, Everyone's Almanac, was one of 19 volumes that comprise a veritable compendium that provides to this day an unrivaled archive in print of the late Ottoman and immediate post-Ottoman Armenian experience in every conceivable field. Published annually between 1907 and 1929, with an interval of almost 4 years during the genocide years and their immediate aftermath, the Almanac is much more than a mere resource of empirical data. To the scholar, when read closely, it also provides a window into the worldviews of its editors and of the hundreds of authors and subjects assembled in its pages. Its longevity from 1907 to 1929 provides unparalleled insights into the evolving zeitgeist and perspectives and their engagement and responses to events and the changing world around them. Thinking of these volumes as almanacs in the traditional sense of the word, its etymology suggests either a Greek or Arabic origin for calendars or lists of data, would be misleading, as such a view only provides an incomplete and reductive picture of their breadth and ambition, as I mentioned earlier. These come into sharp relief when one looks at the vastness of the content of the 19 published editions, totaling more than 8,500 plus pages. Writing in a 1967 essays entitled Amenun Teotiga, Everyone's Teotig, Teotig's nephew, the poet and novelist Shahan Shahnur, had rightly described the Almanac as a, and I quote, a small encyclopedia that would save from oblivion countless fragments, and documents, of Armenian culture, and that more than any other publication would make the word of the Armenian mind audible. That's what he wrote. This paper seeks to investigate this body of material, images and texts, firstly, as a unique archive for art and cultural historical material, and secondly, by shining a light on the vastly different and evolving sensorial and sociopolitical contexts in which these were assembled and produced, how these contexts are reflected in those materials. The presentation is interested in the Teotig's modus operandi, how they operated and how they managed to assemble such rich and diverse material, and the motives that drove them in their endeavors. The paper argues that in the general absence of accessible archives on the Ottoman Armenian art historical experience, these almanacs constitute an irreplaceable body where the art or cultural historian is able to track down, trace, and discover the names of and view reproductions of works by often unknown or forgotten artists. I will provide brief selected examples to highlight the Teotig's use of their favorite tool of biography and how the different conditions under which different editions of the Almanac were produced have affected or determined what is included and what is left out, often in acts of self-censorship, and also the manner in which they are presented. And before I begin, so I just want to point out that we know of Teotig's Almanac as Teotig's Almanac, as in the singular. But of course, there were two Teotigs. There was a Mr. Teotig and there was a Mrs. Teotig. And Arshagui Teotig, who was an important intellectual, is usually forgotten and her place is not properly acknowledged. So when we think about the Teotig's Almanacs, we really need to think about both of them equally, because without Arshagui's editing skills, etc., Teotig would not have been able to create and collate the work that we have before us. So with this in mind, I propose the application of a loose periodization on the publication of the almanacs. So these are four proposed periods that often subtly bleed into each other. So to be able to understand this vast body of material, I've divided them into sort of four periods, but they're not set in stone. So one period sort of blends and bleeds into the other. So by periodization, I mean I will construct loose groupings of periods to highlight the differing sensorial, political, and socioeconomic conditions under which the various editions were published. It is important to bear in mind that the Teotigs were constantly assembling material throughout the year and would send their completed manuscripts to press at some point in the November of the preceding year. Hence, the above-mentioned 1914 edition would have been sent to press in November 1913, thus reflecting the conditions of the previous year prior to November. The periodization follows the following rationale. First seeing the light of day in 1907, under the strict censorial regime of Abdulhamid II's final years. So he ruled between 1876 to 1908, 1909. So I call this the first period. The Almanac continued publication in the liberal environment of the second constitutional period. So this is when Abdulhamid was deposed and a more liberal regime basically took over. So in this period, one finds a more outspoken tone and the inclusion of content that would have been considered seditious by the Ancien regime. So what I'm saying is that in 1910, you would have basically found published material that would have been impossible to find in the 1907, 1908 almanacs, because the regime would have simply closed him down and confiscated and destroyed the manuscripts and probably imprisoned him as well. It was because of such content that Teotig was caught out by the gradual illiberal tightening of censorship under the Ittihad Veteraka regime. So the liberal regime sort of gradually sort of morphed into a more sort of into the dictatorship of Ittihad Veteraka. So after 1913, so Teotig was arrested and he was sentenced to prison for 1 year in 1915. It is a strange circumstance. They didn't like something that he'd basically published. That would have been perfectly fine published in 1911 or 1912, but sort of, you know, in 1913, 1914, it was regarded as seditious. So it is the strange circumstances of his imprisonment that saved him from the mass gathering of Armenian intellectuals on April the 11th, 24th, according to the new calendar. Yet he wasn't spared. Following his release, he too was arrested and spent the years of the Armenian genocide and World War I in exile. Against all odds, he survived, was rescued, and spent years in hiding in the Anatolian interior. And the story of his survival is in itself really fascinating. And maybe in the Q&A, I can sort of tell you the story. It's really a fascinating story. So for those interested sort of in digging deeper, I would recommend as a starting point, Rita Sulahian Kuyumjian's very readable biography published by the Gomidas Institute in London. That's the cover. That's the cover of the biography. So upon his return to Constantinople, so after the genocide, this is 1918, so Constantinople was now under British occupation. Teotig immediately set about the resumption of the publication of the Almanac. Unsurprisingly, it had been suspended during these years, taking advantage of the free press environment of the armistice years, and I call this a third period. So he also published a seminal work, Hushatsan Abuldasanmegi, Monument to April the 11th, collating and recording the names and the circumstances of the murders of 763 Ottoman Armenian intellectuals and clergy who fell victim to the genocide. And over there, you see the cover of that particular publication. Teotig assembled a smaller issue, 1916 to 1920 after his return. And from then on, as regularly as before. So 1916 to 1920 is a tiny issue. And he included material that he'd actually intended for the 1916 edition, but of course he was arrested and it was never published. So some of that appears in the 1916 to 1920 issue. Yet by 1922, with the successes on the battlefield and the advance of the Turkish nationalist armies under Mustafa Kemal and the burning of Smyrna, Izmir, things looked increasingly precarious for the remnants of the Ottoman Armenian population, now assembled mainly in Constantinople, the city where Teotig and Ashagui had launched their almanac in 1907, and where all subsequent issues had been published. Yet in January 1922, Ashagui had passed away in Lausanne. She had TB. And by 1923, Teotig had joined the thousands of exiles in the final dispersion and ended up in exile first to Corfu, then Nicosia in Cyprus, and finally Paris, where he passed away in 1928. All editions from 1924 onwards were published in exile, and this is what I call the fourth period, with the 1929 edition published in Paris posthumously. So let us briefly look at the art historical content of these proposed four periods. First period. The first three issues, 1907, 1908, and 1909, were captioned Sposali Yevbidani, for passing the time and for being useful, and mainly assembled during the reign of Abdul Hamid II. So one can see the compulsory ode to the Sultan on his birthday. So the slide here sort of shows a very, very sort of simple cover. And over there, in the other two images, you basically see an ode to the Sultan with a tughra at the very top of the two pages. So wishes for the long life and health of the Sultan, etc. So these issues are very light on art historical material. There's hardly anything. There's almost no mention of Ottoman Armenian art production, except the incidental listing of the death of an artist or craftsman. The material published reveals the strongly Western European academic tradition of art that Constantinople intellectuals favored. For example, the 1907 Almanac reproduces a compilation of the best paintings of the world. And there's a list of the best paintings in the world, where all the works listed are by long deceased European artists and are mostly altar paintings and religious works, except Leonardo's La Gioconda, Velázquez's Las Meninas, and Murillo's Melon Eaters. There is an interesting discussion of the history of Oriental rug making. So most interesting, however, is a short story by the artist and poet Diran Chirakian, whose pseudonym was Indra, called Nagara, the picture, from the Memories of an Artistic Type, where he vividly narrates his encounter during the 1880s with the work of a mysterious artist and his responses as a child to this work by this artist, who was called J. Davoud. I have not been able to identify who this painter is. I have no idea. So moving on to 1908. 1908 is equally thin. It contains a portrait photograph of the recently deceased painter bishop Mampre Margosian of Jerusalem, and lists the deaths of the artist Mihran Mardigan. He was an important Istanbul artist. The sculptor Avedis Ambarjian, the antiquarian Kevor Kelekian, and the headmaster goldsmith Mardi Kapamajian. Hagop Arabian's article Keretzig Arvest, The Fine Arts, on sculpture only refers to the works of the great European masters from Michelangelo to Rodin, and a brief piece by the artist Stepan Arayan, who designed the cover that we saw earlier, discussing Murillo's Vera Pochumen Subgusin, the Assumption of the Holy Virgin, in a short piece entitled Negarchutian Ashkaren from the World of Painting. So I think we've got, yes, that's Stepan Agayan over there, and that's his discussion of the painting. So again, it's all about Western art, and there's absolutely no mention of Ottoman Armenian artists. So finally, 1909, even thinner on art historical material, reproduces photographs of the hero Enver. That's this picture of Enver Pasha, and the recently deceased but once celebrated Constantinople artist Telemac Exergian, who had passed away in New York. A caricature by the writer and later founder of the AGBU Nubau Library in Paris, Aram Andonian, and the fascinating poem Kire Marte, the Man of Letters, by a certain G.H. Beshkoturian, in the form of a human figure, and you can see that right in the middle. So you can see the caricature of Andonian over there, and the poem is over there. And my understanding of it is that it just basically lists body parts. So and they all sort of put together, create this human figure. So yet one senses a departure in tone in the 1909 Almanac, partly prepared after the establishment of the second constitutional period. Texts expressly and openly discuss the 1894-1897 massacres. Articles adopt a more political tone, and prefiguring the freedom of the early post-Abdul Hamid II years, democracy, brotherhood, and tolerance are praised, with autocracy proclaimed as the enemy. So here we move into the second period, quite gently, sort of slipping into the second period. Our second period encompasses the editions published between 1910 to 1915. Yet here too, from 1913 onwards, we see the gradual tightening of censorship, which will eventually mean that Teotig ends up finding himself in breach of the rules, leading to his imprisonment. 1910, prepared at the end of 1909, after the expulsion of Abdul Hamid II, heralds a more assured departure in the Almanac's engagement with the visual arts. The subheading for passing the time and being useful is replaced by, I quote, the small encyclopedia of the free Armenian, Azad Hayun Bezdik Hanraki Darana. And we can see that in the, right under the title, Amenun Davetsuitsa, it says Azad Hayun Bezdik Hanraki Darana. So this is a sort of age of freedom. And this is revealing on how the Teotigs began to view the Almanac, but also provides an acknowledgement of the new unprecedented political environment they find themselves operating in. The volume is revealing of the editor's newfound freedom in negotiating the newly achieved liberalization of expression, the conscious desire to make the Almanac a more serious publication, an encyclopedia, but also a space to celebrate Ottoman Armenian successes, something frowned upon by the ancient regime. And from 1890 onwards, the situation was particularly tense between the Abdul Hamid II regime and the Armenian population of the empire. So any expression of Armenian identity sort of became highly difficult and problematic, to the extent that paintings of Armenian subject matters were not actually allowed to be exhibited. So, so that's basically the environment we're sort of talking about. So we've come out of that environment into this new environment of freedom. The most explicit expression of this confidence is found in the Teotig's commission for the cover design. So it's Agayan again. Agayan's bold illustration depicting the walls of the medieval Pakraduni capital of Ani is the most explicit signifier of the changing times. This would never have been tolerated under Abdul Hamid II. With this full-color reproduction, the symbol of a glorious Armenian historical past and statehood is emblazoned on the Almanac's cover, something unthinkable only 2 years prior. The new freedom and political climate is reflected in reports on visits by Turkish liberals to the mass grave of those killed during the massacres of 1896 at Balaklı Cemetery, the unveiling of commissions for the building of monuments, and S. Papelyan's composition, Vivan le Jeune Turc, Long Live the Young Turks. The chronicle style used in the 1910 edition also provides the first mentions of Ottoman Armenian artists' successes abroad and is peppered with references to the arts. These include brief listings, such as the artist Dikran Yesayan's. He was the husband of Zabel Yesayan, the most, in my view, probably the most important writer to have written in Western Armenian. Returned to Constantinople from Paris. And the celebration of the successes of Ottoman Armenian artists at the Champs-Élysées exhibition, where the Constantinople-born Zakari Zakarian had exhibited 6 still lifes, the Erzurum-born Arsen Shabanyan 2 seascapes, the celebrated engraver Edgar Shahin 6 engravings, and Sebuh Janik, he was a sculptor, 1 sculpture. Meanwhile, a short piece on Mars excavations of Ani ties in well with Agayan's image, as does a group photograph of the Russian Armenian seascape artist Kevo Pashinjaryan's studio, where 2 paintings with the view of Ani are visible in the background. And I think we can see that in the 3rd picture. I'm sorry, it's the other way around. I just had to fit it in there. So you can sort of barely see the Cathedral of Ani sort of just under the number 5. So. And also the portrait of Aramandonyan was by the Turkish artist Ibrahim Bey. Most amusing details in this particular edition was instructions of how to clean varnished oil paintings using onions, and Ashagui discusses the Oxford-Cambridge boat race, so obviously very important. The 1911 and 1912 editions carry on in the same spirit. Most notable is another cover of an allegorical image. We can think of the Almanac as an actor in commissioning art. So again, it was produced by Stepan Agayan. With slight differences, the 1911 edition includes a portrait of Teotig in a roundel with past, present, future inscribed at the bottom and a small text by Teotig. A note at the bottom of the image directs the reader to the article, the cover of the Almanac, on page 361 for an interpretation of the image, which includes a photograph of Stepan Agayan as well. Teotig, clearly delighted with the image, notes that it will be used in future editions as well. Praising the image, the editor of the Daily Jamalag exclaimed, "An art jury would give it a prize." So they were very happy with it. Perusing the volumes published during this period, one cannot help but be astounded by the flowering of the arts and performance in Constantinople during those years. For example, 1911 includes reports on concerts by Gomidas and vibrant Armenian theater and dance performances by avant-garde female dancer Armen Ohanyan, a kind of Armenian Isadora Duncan. The Almanac also celebrates the successes of Ottoman Armenian artists abroad. For example, the sculptor Haik Patigyan's statue of Abraham Lincoln in San Francisco, or an exhibition of 60 paintings by Arsen Shabanyan and his award of a Légion d'honneur in Paris. And also at home, for example, a certain Miss Elise Mehderian's passing of a successful exam, where we don't know, and her being sent at the state's expense to perfect her art in painting, somewhere in Europe, we don't know. A certain Miss Sophia Nemen's first prize for her needlework, or the Sultan Mehmed Reshad's appreciation of a gift of a silver miniature of the Sultan Selim Mosque, crafted by Armenian master Asadur, which had taken 12 years to make, presented to the Sultan during a visit to Edirne by the local community. In the 1911 edition is especially important in that it marks the beginning for the systematic use of biographies, which often include photographs as well as previously unpublished samples of work, poems, short stories, paintings, or sketches. Teotig relentlessly chased figures across the arts and sciences to supply him with these texts and images, as well as previously unpublished works or letters for publication. Teotig's collection of biographies does not go unnoticed. For example, the writer Vertanes Papazian, writing from Shushi in Russian Transcaucasia, commends Teotig for publishing biographies. The author Hovannes Kazanjian from Tokat notes that, and I quote, "The Almanac has now found its path," end of quote, and notes among his compliments for the improvement and organization of contents that, and I quote, "it will have a lasting value than just for passing enjoyment, a source of documents, especially of biographies and chronologies, end of quote. From an art historical perspective, the content of 1912 is particularly impressive. In lieu of a preface, Teotig reproduces an Armenian calligraphic work by the renowned teacher and calligrapher Khatchig. So we've got the cover, we've got the calligraphic work in the middle by Khatchig. Khatchig is a very interesting character because he produced all these albums for embroidery, so how to embroider with sort of Armenian sort of alphabet styles, etc. So you get to the creation of Gothic Armenian alphabets, but also Latin alphabets, etc. So he's a very interesting artist, calligrapher, but also a teacher as well. For the first time, an entire new section, a part 4, called Hayashchar, Keralvest, Yev Keralvesti Marter, Armenian World, Fine Arts, and People in the Fine Arts. So you can see that right over there at the other end, under 1912, is devoted to the arts, among which the visual arts, and especially painting, are the most prominent. Biography is a preferred method, but several images, for example, photographs or reproductions of paintings or sketches, are also reproduced independently. So here are some examples. We've got some. I included these two artists because even though they were important, they're completely forgotten. For example, Abraham Sakayan, we wouldn't have really known anything about him had it not been for Teotig's sort of brief biography, and Jacques Damad as well, sort of, you know, he's almost completely forgotten. There's a painting by Jacques Damad. Again, we wouldn't have seen this painting had Teotig not reproduced it. Better known artists like Arsène Chabanyan in his studio. Again, I'm sorry for the sort of crooked photograph. Charles Atamian, so it's a biography of Charles Atamian with a picture. And I think one of the most important Armenian artists of the early 20th century, Panos Tevlemezyan, and we see painting by him and also a photograph by him on the third page over there. A prime example of Teotig's approach to biography is provided by that of the once highly respected but now mainly forgotten artist Simon Hagopian. And of course, I had to mention Simon Hagopian. So there you go. And this is Teotig's biography of Simon Hagopian. And it's a picture of my own, for my own copy. So you can basically see my handwritten notes sort of written, scribbled on the side. It is almost certain that Hagopian himself had supplied Teotig with the text and the images, a photographic portrait and a reproduction of one of his most celebrated paintings, Hamals on the Bridge at Karaköy. And this painting is particularly important to me because my entire PhD sort of started when I sort of stumbled across page 248 of the 1912 edition of Teotig's Almanac. And it's a grainy edition. And it was a eureka moment which changed my life. And I thought, this is realism. This is realism. So, and from then, that was basically the starting point of my PhD. So it's a particularly important sort of image for me. So the text follows an established formula. It begins by providing basic information of the artist's state and place of birth, education and training, notable works, awards, and often a quote or two by or on the artist. I can't stress enough how vital this type of information is to the art historian. In the absence of archives, these fragments collected by the Teotigs are often the only scraps of information we have about these artists and their work. Used alongside the rare article or review scattered on the pages of the Ottoman Armenian press, these invaluable biographies provide the basis upon which art historians are able to piece together clues and get a better understanding of the art world of a bygone yet important age. Yet whilst perusing these texts, one must be cautious of the pitfalls of these autobiographical notes, which is basically what many of these texts are, where individuals may be tempted to correct their own pasts. Hagopian's biography is a case in point. For example, the biography here claims that he won a gold prize at the Academy of Fine Arts of Constantinople when he graduated. And I later found out in a newspaper that he'd actually won a silver prize. So someone's correcting something somewhere. So So 1912 sets the scene for the approach to art historical material that all subsequent almanacs follow to the 1915 edition, and onto our third period, which begins with the publication of the 1916 to 1920 edition. Aha, sorry. So this is the image of the Hammaz, and this is the actual painting. It took me 18 months to sort of track it down in the entrance hall of a 90-year-old carpet seller in Paris, and he wouldn't let me sort of go and see it. And I begged him, and I begged him, and I turned up, and eventually he gave up, and he allowed me 1 hour to see it. So I took it down from the wall, and I took 300 photographs of it because I thought I will probably never see it ever again. But the good thing is he then sold it to a collector in Istanbul, and it's actually in a safe home. It's an Armenian collector in Istanbul, basically has it in his collection today. So, and everyone has sort of free access to it, which is the way it should be. Third period. Our third period encompasses those almanacs assembled and produced in Constantinople during the armistice period between 1919 and 1922, and include the 1923 edition. One sees the reinstatement of the subtitles Sposali and Bidani, yet the tone, especially of the 1916 to 1920 edition, one of the smaller volumes in the series, is unsurprisingly very somber. Much of the edition glances back at the years of the genocide, but also those preceding it. For example, several items intended for a 1916 edition, which was never published and was saved by Arshagui, are now incorporated into the issue. Interestingly, 70% of the texts are by Teotig himself, as many of his contributors had been murdered during the genocide. In this issue, we see a Teotig who is bitter and full of rage. For example, in his calendar, he refuses to celebrate Odar, non-Armenian saints, instead replacing them with the names and photographs of those murdered during the genocide. While much of the art historical material reflects the somber mood of the volume, for example, the plunder of art is discussed with outrage, including oil on canvases and religious art, some of which were sent to Austria and Germany, or the rush by the Austrian embassy staff to buy cheap carpets from the deported. The confiscation and destruction of thousands of newly printed volumes by the government, including a volume with artwork by Stepan Agayan. Other reports detail the efforts for the salvation of antiquities from sites such as Subgarabet Monastery in Mush and the Sanasarian Library in Sivas. Alongside the just bitterness, the reorganization and resurrection of the nation are also at the heart of the volume. Achievements of surviving artists, including Leon Serap Kürkcan, who had been deported to Adana, had survived and had now returned to Constantinople, and the relaunching of the fine art journal Vostan by Mikhail Shamdanjian, despite the murder of its previous editor Dikran Chogurian during the genocide, provide hope and are celebrated. So there's sort of an extensive, so between pages 104 and 111, we have this sort of extensive sort of art chronicle, including works by artists such as Panos Terlemesian, Arshak Fedvadjian, images of ruins, Sarkis Khachaturian, Stepan Agayan. There are new stamps of famous Armenians produced by Stepan Agayan for the Armenian Republic. I'm not quite sure whether they were ever actually printed. So Teotig is particularly excited by the goals of the newly launched Armenian Fine Arts Society in Pera, Perai Haikeral Vesagan Miutyun, which are to revive and modernize Armenian styles, to encourage and support the work of Armenian artists, and to introduce Armenian art to the civilized world, which Teotig admits is not an easy task and wishes them well. Civilized word is his wording, it's not my wording. 1921, 1922, and 1923, all of which reproduce the coat of arms of the by then already Sovietized and truncated Armenian Republic on either the cover or the title page of these issues. So they basically follow in the same vein. Again, we have a section entitled Part 2, Armenian Art Yesterday and Today, which introduced, among others, a section on Armenian American artists. The so-called fine arts are clearly present. They're clearly present here. The artists discussed include Hai Patigyan, Hovsep Pushman, Mihran Serayan, and Kalus Chilingirian, all Armenian American artists. And he reproduces photographs of the artists and their works and examples of their works. But also we see scholarly articles such as an extensive piece by Hampatsum Zortian on the history of ceramic making, published in the 1923 volume, and much discussion on the Armenian ceramic production of Kütahya. And so that's the cover of the 1923 edition. And that's the article on Khatchig, the ceramics. And it's a really extensive article. And I personally had to sort of scan this several times and send it to scholar friends who basically are working on Kütahya ceramics at the moment. The edition also includes several obituaries. For example, the death of Russian Armenian artist Vazken is marked by in a heartfelt piece by Panos Peterlemesian. And he describes the deceased as an exceptional artist and describes the pain he feels as enormous. Other obituaries in the 1922 edition include a moving piece on Simon Hagopian, the artist that we discussed earlier in the 1912 edition, who had passed away in 1921. So, and again, that's the cover of the 1922 edition, and that is the obituary of Simon Hagopian with one of his images. It's a dervish in the courtyard of a mosque. So the entire part 1, pages 3 to 32 of the 1923 volume is devoted to Ashagui. I don't really need to tell you how sort of heartbroken and grief-stricken Teotig was when he lost his wife in 1922. And this brings us to the final and fourth period. Our final period incorporates the volumes published in exile in Vienna, Venice, and Paris. So, and I've included the covers of the 3 editions. The content is as before. There's a lot of sort of art historical material. For example, there's a very interesting article by Hrant Almanac. I thought I had a slide, but I don't. I'm sorry. A single article, Monsieur Pierre, published in the 1928 edition, publishes and takes the reader through Teotig's precarious and traumatic experiences and thought processes. This is in the 1928 edition. The article reads almost like a microcosm of the larger Almanac project, as it details how the author, Teotig, has gone about chasing and finally obtaining the important material he so wants to include in the Almanac. And I'm sure I have the... Yes, here we are. That's the cover of the 1928 edition, and that is the article Monsieur Pierre with a picture of the artist Bedros Sarabian, who was known as Monsieur Pierre, and that's one of his works. So what is particularly interesting in this article is that it reads as a double biography, completed in the final year of Teotig's life, Monsieur Pierre, which follows the author's journey from the eve of exile from Constantinople in 1922 to his final move to Paris in 1928. Is a deeply personal text where he himself charts and reflects upon his own experiences, modus operandi, playfully mocks his own compulsive perseverance, and bears his soul to the reader. It is also the first text that assembles together disparate clues and forgotten fragments from the once celebrated Constantinople artist and decorator Bedros Sarabian's life and work. Sarabian lived between 1833 and 1896, and I would argue that he's probably the most important artist of Constantinople in the mid to late and immediate post-Tanzimat period. He studied in Rome. He was sent by the Balians to study in Rome. He decorated many of the Ottoman palaces. And then he was also one of the first artists to engage with realism and engage with a social reformist group of intellectuals when things started getting quite tense in Ottoman Armenia. So he's a really, really important artist, but completely forgotten. The images it reproduces are the only known records of works by Sarabian, especially of the important painting Armenian Girl from Paresh. Paresh is Bitlis in modern-day Turkey, painted circa 1883, 1884, which had caused such a stir among Constantinople Armenian intellectuals in the mid-1880s. And the girl from Bitlis is actually his daughter. His daughter was the model for the painting. Once again, the material that Teotig has compiled in Monsieur Pierre provides the source text, which serves and has served as a starting point for scholars. Without Teotig's diligent groundwork, later art historians would have had even less to work with in order to reconstruct an important yet unknown and neglected period in late Ottoman and Ottoman Armenian art history. While Sarabian's work is very far from having been adequately evaluated, and the vast majority of his works remain scattered and unknown, the very fact that each and every art historical text or reference on the artist, from Onni Gaverissian in 1959 to Yerishe Mardikian in 1971, Father Aristages Borjalian in 1989, Gara Kürkman in Istanbul in 2005, and most recently Buke Uras, also in Istanbul in 2015, have primarily relied upon the information gathered and salvaged by Teotig, underscores its importance. Teotig concludes his article with a very revealing plea to Sarabian's daughter, who he had discovered held on to some of her father's important paintings and lived on the island of Kanala, just outside Istanbul. And I quote, "How desirable it would be that some of Sarabian's works that have survived the general shipwreck of the nation," by which he means the genocide, but also 1922, because after 1922, a large part of the community left Istanbul. Most of the intellectuals left as well. So that survived the general shipwreck of the nation would cease from being in the ownership of his daughter on Kanala Island and be gifted instead to the National Gallery of Armenia, thus salvaged once and for all from all the ill surprises that are the inevitable fate of all dispersed communities. May we be forgiven for expecting this honorable action from the equally honorable Fındıklıyan family. That was the marital name of Bedros Sarabian's daughter. End of quote. The 5-page illustrated article, Monsieur Pierre, provides an eloquent articulation of the genocide survivor and exiled intellectuals' anxieties, which characterize the volumes published in our 4th period. It is here that Teotig records his own relentless quest for clues and fragments across scattered transnational networks through which information is still flowing and is exchanged. And it's really interesting because he meets someone who knows someone who knows someone else, who knows someone else, who knows someone else, and who knows Mrs. Fındıklıyan. So there's all these sort of roots, information is gathered and then suddenly collated and presented in Armenian dialect. He also puts to paper his sense of despair at the loss of material culture and memory, and the urgent need or obsession for assembling any survivor fragment remnants of a vanishing collective cultural memory into his very own archive in print. Through Monsieur Pierre, Teotig documents his efforts towards the lifting from the obscurity of forgetting of the legacy of one of the most important Ottoman Armenian cultural figures and artist decorators of the 19th century, Bedros Sarabian. But it is much more than that. It is his sense of urgency to preserve, whether in a printed archive, a physical archive in diaspora, such as the Nubau Library, or from the vantage point of 1922 to 1927, what might have seemed to him the secure museum in an Armenian state, albeit Soviet. A juxtaposition of Sarabian's 1928 biography with that of Simon Hagopian's published in 1912. These are images by Bedros Sarabian that we only know the existence of because they were actually reproduced in Teotig. So I've juxtaposed the two biographies here. So a juxtaposition of Sarabian's 1928 biography with that of Simon Hagopian's published in 1912 clearly reveals in my mind how crucially different the conditions under which these two texts, biographies of two artists, were compiled. Whilst in 1912, Teotig had published biographies of artists such as Hagopian, among several others, in order to celebrate them or to provide his readership with entertaining information. After especially 1923, the onus had shifted towards the salvaging of any biographical fragments that could be obtained by any means in order to preserve the memories of forgotten artists such as Sarabian and their work. Teotig's endeavors to preserve an archive extended also to material objects. This preoccupation comes across in his 1928 letter, written in Paris and addressed to the executive board of the Nubau Library in Paris. In the letter, Teotig offers important letters and documents by Ottoman Armenian intellectuals such as Krikor Odian and Serpui Dusap, which are in his care to the library for safe keeping. In conclusion, this illustrated presentation took took us through an art historical whistle-stop tour through all 19 editions of the Teotig's Almanacs, of the sizable art historical content of the 19 published volumes. It proposed the application of a loose periodization as a means of furthering a more nuanced understanding as to how context had colored the Teotig's handling and treatment of Armenian material culture at different times. It sought to reveal evolving mindsets and expose incentives behind their endeavors. Most importantly, in the absence of accessible physical archives of the art historical production of Ottoman Armenian artists, it proposed the series of almanacs as a cumulative compendium of clues and fragments from biographies to reproductions of now lost images that can help art and cultural historians reconstruct the mostly vanished and forgotten cultural and art historical world in which these artists lived and thrived. And of course, the almanacs are out of print and they're very, very difficult to get hold of. So the good thing is the Gulbenkian Foundation funded the republication of facsimiles of almost every single almanac. Unfortunately, it sort of ended in 1925, so we don't have 26 to 29 available because they were published in Aleppo in Syria, and then the war started, so it sort of stopped. I'm trying to convince them, if they're watching, to republish. Please publish the other 4 as well, because we need them. Thank you very much. I hope that was okay. Thank you.